Hello, welcome back, and welcome to April 1st. This is no April Fool. We are into a new month, and hopefully it will be a better month than March was. You know how I feel about March by now. So we are into part two of our environmental policy, law, regulation part as a way of looking at how we try to deal with environmental problems. And in this part, I'd like to take a look at a little history of U.S. environmental law. And I'm taking this from a presentation by a group called CH2M Hill, which put this together. And I'm borrowing bits and pieces from them and a few other sources. They have a nice little timeline here that you can see, and we'll go through some of these stages. But we'll start with sort of pre-World War II environmental law and what that looked like. So you already know a little bit about the difference between policy and law and regulation, and really there was no federal environmental policy in the United States prior to the World War era. If there was, it was mostly aimed at protecting national parks and conservation areas and things like that. So prior to the World Wars, I would say, most environmental disputes were decided by something called common law, not statutory law. So the difference between those is that common law is defined as law that has been basically ruled on by a judge. And statutory law are laws passed by the federal government or the state government that have been that come out of some overarching environmental policy, and they apply to a broad range of situations. So let's just take a quick example. Let's imagine it's 1912 and your house is situated right next to a neighbor, and the neighbor decides to start raising hogs, and the hogs cause so much smell and waste onto your property that it makes your property unlivable. And it's 1912. So is there some overarching federal law that you can turn to say, hey, neighbor, you are not allowed to do that because of this law? No, there's not, because really there's no federal overarching environmental policy at that time. What you would have to do is take your case to a judge in a court and say, my rights have been infringed upon by this neighbor who is raising hogs. And you might win that suit or you might lose that suit. And the neighbor might have to change his or her activities or not, right? So that would be a common law example. Nowadays, you might have some overarching federal or state law as some part of some environmental policy that you could turn to that would give you some recourse. Prior to the World War era, those didn't really exist. So most of the actions in this early time period were to set aside protected areas like Yosemite National Park and Yellowstone National Park and so on, and to protect commerce. But really there wasn't very much environmental law and no real federal environmental policy at this age. Okay, let's move up to post-World War era. Still not a lot of environmental policy, but we're starting to see a lot more environmental pollution because we are into the industrialized sort of synthetic society that came out of the world wars that we learned about. During this era, the attitude was states and localities should be the ones responsible for having environmental rules. So the federal government saw its role as encouraging states to develop their own standards. So for example, for water quality, State of Ohio, you should develop your own water quality standards. State of Illinois, you should develop your own water quality standards. And by the way, states, it's your job to fund these and enforce them. But they were really just suggestions from the federal government. There was no mandate. There was no enforcement from the federal government. So this is called voluntary compliance. In other words, states were supposed to voluntarily put restrictions on what can people dump into the water or what people can release into the air and things like that, or what pesticides can be used. And this wasn't very successful, as you might guess, because states didn't have the funding for this in a lot of cases, or weren't willing to tax themselves to raise the funding for it. Also, imagine if you are in Ohio and you put a whole bunch of environmental rules on industry and development and business in your area. The businesses are just going to move across the border to Pennsylvania or Indiana or jump to Illinois and build their business there. So there wasn't a lot of effort from states to do this voluntary compliance. So there were some environmental laws passed, federal environmental laws, a Water Quality Act, an Air Pollution Control Act, but they were voluntary compliance laws. In other words, they just said, hey, states, it would be great if you mandated cleaning up the water and cleaning up the air. So these were largely failures. They really didn't improve any of our environmental pollution problems. And we had a lot of emerging environmental problems. So the 1950s and 1960s were not a good time in the world or this country for environmental quality. Here is a picture of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catching on fire. Some of you are from the Cleveland area. You know about this. Rivers are not supposed to catch on fire. This one caught on fire several times in the late 1960s because it was so choked with oil and trash and pollution, and just a nasty, nasty situation. Here is along the Hudson River in New York, a big garbage dump right next to the river. You see a sailboat out there on the river, and the landfill was essentially a dump right next to the river. Not a good situation. We had fish kills all over the country and out into the ocean because of so many pollutants dumped into our waterways. We had oil spills along beaches for many miles. Just not a good situation. Most of us in this day and age have not encountered this level of pollution. So things were not, the situation was not good in the post-World War decades in this country. So let's jump to the 1960s and 1970s in terms of environmental law and policy. This is really the rise of the modern environmental movement, as we've learned about, because of some of the problems and some of the voices that were raised against those problems. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, of course, is a big part of this. We've already talked about that a little bit, aimed at the pesticides that we began to use during this era and the side effects of those pesticides. So finally, there was a big push for a federal environmental policy and some laws that might come out of that during the 1960s. And here you can see some important dates. There was a Clean Air Act and a Wilderness Act passed that set aside some areas for wilderness. That Clean Air Act of 1963 was still pretty weak. Finally, in 1970, we had a National Environmental Policy Act passed. 1970 was kind of a watershed year in many cases. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, all it really is a big long law, but all it really said is that the federal government must consider the environment in any of its actions. Doesn't mean it has to do anything, it just has to consider the environment. But this is the first time we had any sort of law that said the federal government had to consider the environment in its actions. Okay, so on into the 1970s and into the 1980s, we really had some action on passing some environmental laws with teeth in them that didn't just rely on voluntary compliance, it actually mandated some things. So this a lot of times is called, the 1970s called the environmental decade, and many important environmental laws began during this time. And importantly, they mandated states, and not just states, but private industry and organizations and companies to adhere to some laws. And it started some agencies like the EPA, for example. And the EPA's job is to create regulations from these laws and enforce those regulations. It set standards and initiated controls and mandated some controls for things like air pollution. So if you have a smokestack and you're spewing forth pollutants into the atmosphere, you have to control, and we're going to measure what some of those pollutants are, and you have to control them below a certain level. So those state assistant programs, the voluntary compliance, were replaced with some laws that really had some federal mandates. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act are two of them. First Earth Day happened in 1970. The EPA was formed in 1970. NEPA started in 1970. So this was a big environmental year. Here's a picture, by the way, of a place called Love Canal in New York. This was in the 1970s. It's a sad story. But a big toxic waste dump. You see the barrels sitting out there. So toxic, hazardous, cancerous waste was just being dumped in barrels into this field. And then, believe it or not, this is still incredible to me, but this was all kind of buried in a shallow dump. And then the area decided to purchase that land and build a school on top of it. It's incredible. And sadly, a number of the students attending that school got leukemia from exposure to those chemicals. So that just shows you how little oversight we had prior to some of these laws, that you could just dump hazardous waste out in a field and then someone would decide it's a good idea to build a school on that. We don't really live in that situation now, but that wasn't that long ago when we did. Okay, so here's just a nice little timeline of some of the major environmental laws. All of these are really long, complicated laws. You could study them more. We could probably have a class on each of these. But the Clean Air Act in 1970, Water Pollution Control Act, or what's commonly called the Clean Water Act in 1972, FIFRA, Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. This was finally a law that controlled some of those pesticides that we talked about that historically had some real problems with some of the chemicals we were using. An Ocean Dumping Act. Prior to this, it was legal to dump waste directly into the ocean. It didn't matter what kind of waste. That's crazy, isn't it? But now, finally, in 1972, we had a law that said, no, you can't just dump anything into the ocean. You guys are familiar with the Endangered Species Act, 1973. The Safe Drinking Water Act said we're actually going to look at what's in your drinking water, and there are regulations, there are standards for what can or can't be in your drinking water. Toxic Substances Control Act, and something called RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The purpose of this law was to say, if you are a business or an organization that creates any sort of hazardous waste, and we'll make a list of what those are, we need to know how much you're creating, when you created it, how you transported it, where you disposed of it, and here are some ways that you are allowed to dispose of it in a proper hazardous waste landfill. So you have to keep records on all of this stuff that you are creating and disposing of. Prior to that law, we really didn't have regulations on that. And then CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. That's a mouthful. Everybody calls this Superfund. Let's take a quick side look at this. This is an interesting law. Many of you maybe have heard of Superfund. So this was established because we had, like Love Canal, in fact, Love Canal was one of the first examples of this, lots of places around the country where hazardous waste had essentially just been dumped. There was no law, and so it had just been disposed of, and now it's making people sick. Here are a couple, an example in addition to Love Canal. This is a place called Times Beach, Missouri. In Times Beach, Missouri, there was a petroleum company that had waste oil, and they decided to use that waste oil to spray on the roads because they had a lot of dirt roads that would get very dusty in the summertime when it was dry, and spraying oil on that helped keep the dust down. So over a period of about 4 years, they spread about 160,000 gallons of waste oil on these roads to keep the dust down. It did help to keep the dust down. Unfortunately, it was contaminated with a chemical called dioxin, which we've mentioned before in class. And it contaminated that town so badly that people started getting sick. Horses were dying, birds were dying. A bad situation for sure. And so because of CERCLA, the federal government moved in and essentially purchased the town. It is now a ghost town. They bought all the properties in the town, moved the people out, and actually had to come in and dig up the soil and put it in barrels and put those barrels in a hazardous waste landfill. This took many years to do and ended up costing about $200 million for the cleanup. So this was one of the first Superfund sites. So a Superfund idea is that we are going to create a big pile of money that is going to involve federal cleanup of hazardous waste sites. Who's going to pay into that fund? The idea was the polluter should pay. In other words, if there was a company that's liable for this, they should pay for the cleanup. Unfortunately, that sometimes doesn't work because that company has gone out of business, or they can successfully argue, hey, back in the 1940s or 50s when we dumped this stuff or spread this oil, there was no law that said we couldn't. We are not guilty of breaking any law. So in some cases, the polluter pay principle hasn't quite worked, and who ends up paying for it is really the taxpayers. But it's very necessary because we have far too many of these Superfund sites that were never should have happened, but they did, and they're making people sick over many, many years, and they need major cleanup. So that's CERCLA, just an example of one of these major laws. Here, by the way, is an interesting website. If you just Google Superfund sites where you live, a site will pop up that's put together by the US EPA. This is an interactive website, and so I just snipped the map here, and so you can look at it, look how many Superfund sites we have. You can zoom to wherever you live if you live on this map. If you don't, if you live in another country, then they might have something similar. And you can click on some of these and see what's the status, what was the problem, and has it been cleaned up, or is it in the process? All of these are expensive. All of them are long-term cleanup efforts, but very necessary and really needs federal oversight in my opinion. Otherwise, they just wouldn't get cleaned up. So you can take a look at that if you're interested. Okay, so this era of big federal oversight, if you are an industry, let's imagine, you could just think about all the laws that might apply to you. So here is a factory pumping out smoke, and it has the Clean Air Act involved because it's pumping out smoke. It has CERCLA, Superfund site where it's disposing of waste. Here's the Clean Water Act as it's disposing of wastewater. Safe Drinking Water Act might be included there. Ocean Dumping Act might be included there. Toxic Substances Control Act might be included because they are dealing with some sort of toxins. Here's RCRA, how is that waste being disposed of? You get the idea. So there's lots of laws suddenly pertaining to any sort of business activity that uses air or water, or affects land, or affects how people live. So in a sense, this is good, right? This is what we were talking about, mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. These are laws that our country has agreed upon to say, okay, we need to regulate how we do this stuff. You can imagine for the business, this is going to make doing business much more expensive. And you have to hire specialists that understand the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. You have to keep track of your waste and things like that. All good, but also making doing business much more expensive. But because it had federal oversight, that means you can't just jump across the border to Indiana and behave badly because the law applies to Indiana too. What it does mean, though, is you could move your business to another part of the world that doesn't have these environmental laws. And of course, that is what has happened over the last 30, 40 years in a big way. Not just for this reason, but partially for this reason. A lot of industry has relocated to the global south, for lack of a better term, where there are no environmental regulations, and they can get around some of these rules because the rules don't exist. So the outsourcing of industry to other parts of the world and the dumping of waste in other parts of the world that we talked about as environmental justice issues, partially because the United States has created some really strong environmental regulations, and it's not a level playing field. Not every country has those same rules. Okay, in the 1980s, a lot of these laws were renewed and expanded and strengthened. So you see about every 5 to 10 years, these laws are reinitiated and amended. And a lot of these were continually updated and still continue to be. They were made a lot tougher. They called these the hammer provisions in the 1980s. So the deadlines got stricter, the standards got more strict. How much arsenic are you allowed to have in your wastewater? How much mercury are you allowed to emit out your smokestack? Those all got much tougher. And the EPA and other agencies really sort of added a lot of personnel and had big budgets and started really enforcing these rules in the 1980s. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, that means our environment got a lot cleaner. And after the 1950s and 60s, we really needed it to. Another little thought is that states also have environmental protection laws, and they are required, of course, to follow the federal law and the regulations that come from federal law. States have the option of making their own laws, and they can make them more strict if they want to. So California is an example of a state that has much more stringent environmental laws than the federal laws. States are allowed to do that. States are not allowed to say, oh, in this state, we're going to make our laws weaker than the federal laws. You have to at least follow the federal law standard. You can make it more stringent, but not less stringent. So some states have made things a little more strict. Some states are just following the federal law and have very few state regulations. And then, of course, this is all locally implemented. What that means is each individual business or landowner or even individual or organization has to comply with those laws. And usually that means they have to get a permit to do, or a series of permits to do their activity. And that means they're going to be inspected occasionally by the EPA or some other organization to see if they're in compliance with the laws. So there's a lot of human structure around this and infrastructure to make all this work. So we get into the 1990s and the early 2000s and the 2010s, and an interesting sort of backlash to all of this. There's kind of a push for deregulation amidst all this. And you might think, we put all this money and all this time and all this effort into coming up with some decent environmental laws, and now there's real pushback. And it's true. There's a kind of what they call a regulatory recoil. So there was a thought I guess, that emerged in the 90s and is still with us today, that we are over-regulating things. And that's making it hard for businesses to make money and to employ people and to expand their operation and to grow the economy. And we don't want our GDP to stagnate. And so there's a push to reduce this regulation. And this has, in some ways, been successful. So here are some of the activities in the 1990s that sort of tried to remove unnecessary regulations or reduce the role that the EPA would play on enforcing some of these, to encourage small business and large business to do its thing, and to reduce regulations that didn't come with funding. So there's sort of a lot of pushback on federal regulation. Partially as a result of that, we have had, in response, some big environmental disasters that might have been circumvented if we had even tougher regulations. But there's real pushback against more regulations. And if you're paying attention to the news at all today in 2020, not just the virus news, but the political news, there's still a big anti-regulation push, reducing regulation, deregulate. And there's even some voices calling for voluntary compliance. Again, remember we had that in the post-World War era, and it didn't work very well. But there are some people saying we should go back to voluntary compliance, that businesses and even states should be able to voluntarily set and reach their own standards. And it seems like we've already tried that and it didn't work very well. So there is pushback against a lot of environmental regulation these days. Okay, just to recap. Overall, this little history of environmental law and regulation has been remarkably successful in this country. We have really reduced water pollution and air pollution and hazardous waste dumps. We phased out some chemicals that were really obviously causing human harm or environmental harm. We have reduced toxic air pollution and water pollution. We've really cleaned up our rivers and lakes and bays. All of this because we had some tough environmental laws that finally came online. Look at this stat. Due to these environmental laws and regulations, the average global life expectancy increased by 8 years through this process. So food is safer, water is safer, air is safer, people are living longer on average than in the 1950s. And a lot of this because of tough environmental laws and regulations. But look at the last bullet here. Further environmental progress is increasingly difficult because a lot of people see it as encroaching on individual rights and curtailing business and slowing the economy, which often seems to be our holy grail. We always want to grow the economy faster. And yeah, so that's the situation. So if anybody ever tells you that these environmental laws are not necessary, I think that's incorrect. I think this country already lived through the process of not having tough federal environmental laws, and we see what the results were, and we see how much better things are today because we have all of those regulations. And by the way, people are still able to have jobs and make money in the face of environmental regulations, as long as those regulations apply to everyone. Okay, so that's a pretty good overview, I think, very quick overview of some environmental laws and regulations in the United States. Obviously, there's a lot more detail to all of that. Someday you could take a class on environmental law or regulation or policy and learn a little bit more about those laws and how they're made. So we do not have a lab this week because we have the quiz. And on Friday, we're going to be talking about green democracy. So make sure you have read that section in the book, and I will reconnect with you then. Have a good day.